So this is the final panel of the day, and the idea here is to ask three wonderful people to try to summarize a little bit, very briefly, give us some impressions of what they got out of the day. And after they do that, we're going to implement a version of something that Megan Smith suggested, but it's not going to be exactly what she wants because she started giving me more instructions. She can add them after I say this. But we're going to ask every table to talk to itself, or join another table if there are too few of you, to answer the questions that Jonathan raised at lunch today, and to just have a discussion of that. And about 4 o'clock we'll end, and I will ask. I'm sorry, 5 o'clock, 5:30 we'll end that discussion. Looking optimistic that I'll drink sooner rather than later. 5:30 we'll end that and have each of the table report something about what they heard, okay? And so the questions, again, and I'll remind you again after the panelists talk, is what new thing did you learn? Or what made you think differently and how about something you already knew? So did you reframe some question or think different, get a different context for it, a different way of thinking about it? You three don't have to answer that right now. You have some time. You can go join a table afterwards. Okay, so we have, why don't we just go in the order in which people have sat. So that's Jamie, Nancy, and Alfred.
Thank you very much, Margaret. So Nancy and Alfred and I violently agree that there's no way to summarize this conversation. So we're each going to take a couple of slices, I think, of this and do our best to try to knit some of the conversation together. I want to say, by way of introduction here, that so if I've spoken at 60 meetings and conferences in the last year, 30 of them have been blah, 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 the future of work. And so I've been in a lot of these conversations, and despite that, I got a lot out of this conversation today. So thank you for a rich and really wonderful discussion. I've spent my life living at this intersection of learning and work, both as a writer as well as someone who's the CEO of a large private foundation that's focused exclusively on getting more people to and through high-quality post-high school, post-secondary learning context, not just higher education in the traditional context, but also workplace-based learning in a direct-to-consumer context, et cetera. I think preparing people for what was discussed earlier, for both good jobs and a good life, is a really important task for us to think about here as we're thinking about technology and the future of work. And our thesis at Lumina Foundation, and really my life's work, I was a first in my family to go to college, is that talent development and deployment is the key to shared prosperity. And particularly in a world where the future of work is changing, where it's uncertain, and where it's inexorable. And I can tell you my definition of talent later if you're interested, but I do think we should be talking about talent, not skills. So let me talk just about higher education for the most part as one slice that I think is worth talking about. And then I do want to talk about something that we haven't actually touched on today, which is our role in philanthropy in this conversation, because I think it would add a little bit of value. Margaret, you made the exceptional point that we're not prepared for the future of work. We don't really have any plans or policy. And I'm really enamored of your Mount Pelerin Society. We can discuss whether or not neoliberalism is the outcome of what we want over drinks, but I think that basic idea that some monolithic or narrowly focused group shouldn't be having these conversations, somebody else shouldn't be making these decisions. We should have broad groups of thinkers with foundations and others talking and working together on this. I say that in part because we all know the data that the lack of faith in institutions of all type, government, corporations, you name it, is at a historic low in both the UK and the US. And I think our ability to sort of knit these pieces together is really important. Building on the points that Earl made at lunch, I think higher education is essential to the task of both rethinking the future of work and preparing people for that uncertain and changing future that I mentioned. And I thought Barbara's plea to spend less time on problems we can't solve, but that seem really cool, and more time, things like superintelligence, and more time on the things that we can solve is a really important thing for us to remember here. And I just want to bring one data point to this conversation that's worth mentioning, which is that if you have any doubt about the criticality of higher education to prepare people for that future, you don't have to look at the historic experience. You can look at what's happened in the last 5 years, 6 years since the last recession ended here in the US, and here I speak specifically to the US, but we've seen similar effects in the UK. Which is what happened with jobs in that time period. So in that time period, in the US, there was 11.6 million new jobs created in the American economy between 2011 and roughly the end of 2016. Of that 11.6 million, 11.5 million of those new jobs went to people with a post-high school education. So essentially, if you have a high school credential or less, you have been left out of the economic recovery that's occurred now for most of the last 6 or 7 years. So preparing people intentionally for the future is really critical, and I think I don't need to make that argument here. I would underscore what's been talked about throughout the day, that we have to be intentional, particularly about who's being developed and prepared for the future of work. Again, if you look at the data in the US, 47% of Americans today have a degree or certificate, a post-secondary degree or certificate, or a graduate degree, a bachelor's degree, an associate degree, or a high-quality certificate, as is defined in the literature. But only 30% of African Americans and 22% of Latinos have that. So we've got to deal with this. This issue of inequity is not some theoretical conversation. It's real. It's about the future of our shared prosperity in a future work world where the fastest growing populations to continue to face the most enormous inequities. I want to mention this idea of the learning ecosystem that came up, and Dan mentioned this in particular, about preparing people for a future of what I think is a future of human work. I think that's what we're really talking about here. And in that future of human work, I don't think this assembly line model of learning, first you learn, then you work, is really going to suffice going forward. Where in this future of work, human interaction is going to be highly valued and not likely to be supplanted by technology. We will need a process for preparing people for human work that's continuous and tightly focused on those who don't have the cultural and social advantage that others might. This issue of clarity of credentials, what do degrees, certificates, certifications, badges, licenses, all of that stuff actually mean is really critical. To paraphrase an American political slogan, it's the learning stupid. We have to remember that what should be behind the credentials is learning, real and relevant learning that you can mention, that you can touch and reference and understand what's there. The credentialing system really is a mess, and again, Dan made that point. But the fact that employers continue to use the BA as a proxy for skills, I think actually represents an opportunity for us to improve that system to better meet both individual and societal needs, and link that highly atomized system that Alex mentioned in her question into an interoperable ecosystem where learning and work advance over the course of a lifetime. I'll skip over the conversation about badges that Alondra raised, but I think it's a really good one to come back to, because I think I think there's a level of complexity that's important. Quickly on philanthropy, let me just say that as someone who's running a $1 billion foundation, we have an enormous responsibility here to provide leadership in this space. And I want to make that point as clearly as I possibly can. We are more than cash registers with a conscience. We actually are society's risk capital. We have the capacity to take risk that no one else has. We don't get voted out of office if the voters don't like the decisions we make. We don't get kicked out by shareholders if they don't like the decisions we make. We are independent, we are endowed, and we should use our risk capital to actually invest in the kinds of changes that are needed. We need to do that through several means. We need to help develop new ideas involving those very diverse perspectives that I mentioned, and actually not just participate in the ideation, but the actual scaling of the best ideas. One of the shortcomings, I think, of philanthropy is that we spent much of our history in the modern era of philanthropy developing interesting ideas and then hoping somebody else will do something with them. I think that's no longer acceptable. We have to insist on equity. Again, we can sort of be a sort of moral conscience on these issues, especially by race and gender, because markets are ill-equipped to do that. I think that, and this may be a controversial point to make, that we need to influence private capital markets, which are morally agnostic, and government, which, despite its incredible dysfunction, actually needs good and scalable ideas. And finally, I think philanthropy needs to be intentional, transparent, and adaptable. Intentional in terms of what we're actually trying to do, transparent in telling you whether or not what we're trying to do is working, which private foundations often don't do, and adaptable, meaning that we should be investing in these conversations and in these new ideas around the relationship between technology and the future of work, and actually rethinking our own premises. Philanthropy is not very good at this. We tend to develop 10-year programs, and then at the end of the 10 years, develop another 10-year program. We don't have time for that in either of our countries. So I think spending more time thinking about technology and the future of work by spending less time on the gee whiz and more on developing and deploying the talent to advance our prosperity is really important, and I got a lot out of this conversation today, so thank you.
I'm Nancy Peretzman. I'm a partner of Allen & Company, and I come to this with a different rubric, which is really a professional rubric in the for-profit sector, allocating capital, on building businesses, and in the nonprofit sector, some analogous experiences. Rather than summarize what I think, first of all, we're also deeply appreciative of the conversation to date and very much look forward to tomorrow. What I thought I would do in the interest of saving time is to make a couple observations that I extracted from today that I thought really were areas that were worth some more thought and energy, in no particular order. I apologize for that. The first is that we all agree a change is coming. There's questions about rate of change, and there's questions about consequences. There are a few fundamentally different givens that heretofore didn't exist, that technology provided the basis for. And the first is, on a worldwide basis, we have a very high percentage, and will continue to see that increase, of connectivity on a one-to-one basis with an instrument, and it's a mobile device. And that gives and allows for a platform of education, information dissemination that heretofore was never available. And how we think about that to enable populations, to me, as we've been sitting here talking about technology and AI, and I've been trying to think about it, turning it upside down to think, okay, what could this enable that we as a society couldn't actually do before? And being able to give people information, to be able to self-identify, to be able to tell them not just what's available, what's happening, and what they need to do. And I'm going to give a small, and I apologize for the anecdotal nature of this story, but it was pretty profound to me. About 8 years ago, some people I knew who were involved in the educational philanthropy world came to me and they said, you know, there's these schools in Florida, and they train people to become basically the lowest end of home health care workers. And there's 3 schools, and Florida has a dearth of needing more people in the health system. And most of the population who go to these schools are mostly people who've just gotten a GED degree. And they tend to be disproportionately single female, and most of them are just coming off the welfare rolls. And they said, we have this idea. We'd like to take what we've learned in these schools and put it online. Because we have this theory that we can go from helping 300 people, and within 3 years, they were up to 8,000 people across the country taking what was an 18-month course. They had a 92% employment rate. They found that the skills, I hate to use the word skills, but the knowledge that they were imparting online was about half of what the required interaction was with this population. The other half were what I would call just contextual know-how. How to interview for a job, where the jobs are, how to set it up, what you say and don't say. And once you're in the job, what are the kind of, think about it as a form of mentoring, what are the kind of things you should do and not do to not be fired? So the key was get them in the job and keep them in the job. And what was very interesting in sort of watching their evolution, I won't tell you what happened because it's a sad, sad, inadvertent byproduct of some bad legislation in terms of what happened to this group. But what they were talking about was they said all of a sudden they were using technology. They were using Skype. They were using technology to become forms of dissemination that otherwise there was no efficient way to get to this population and enable the population and to be able to connect them to work and support otherwise. They had exponential growth on that. And I think as we think about how we're going to redesign what I call sort of the two needs are, one, we have to be able to also use all of technology and AI to, one, enable folks to be connected to what is possible, assist them in the information, assist them in sort of the transitional pieces of this puzzle, and ultimately help them build their own communities. Because the most interesting part of some of the data that I was seeing from this group was that within 2 years, a third of the people that had taken courses and taken jobs went back and said, okay, I now would like an assistant nursing degree. I would like, they sort of, once they were in the system, they could see how they could work their way up because there was instruction that enabled them to do it. And we now have that as a society if we can figure out how to organize ourselves appropriately and use it. The last sort of is getting off the anecdotal. I think the other observation that we all have is that we now have in AI the reality of there are a few very large companies, and both in China and in the United States, who are doing an awful lot of the work that is moving this field forward. And I think that the questions as to what competitive and comparative advantages they have by their own scale and what information they have that creates a competitive advantage for themselves is really something of a very serious consequence. And to the extent that there were bits and pieces of this conversation that came about earlier that referred to, information, data, what does that really mean? What is the transparency of it? The fact is that we have gone, or we are very far along in going from what I call indirect to direct models in this society. And in an indirect model, there was monetization. I come from the media and advertising business. The whole business is predicated on an indirect model. But that connectivity is allowing us to have a direct model. And as a result, oh no, that's not me again. That phone, I can't, Brad, can you get that off? I'll give you my code. It happened all day long. It keeps, I can't, sorry, I apologize. No, it's not a question. I'm having a problem turning the thing off. But the last piece of this is that I think that we have to think about, years ago, one of the early founders of one of the big internet companies told me that this connectivity was going to allow everybody to monetize their own customer acquisition value. This was 20 years ago. And it's a profound thought. And we need to think about exactly what that looks like in terms of the exchange. Last but not least, in an unrelated way.
As I said, this technology is invasive.
Yeah, it's very invasive. Just that, sorry, throw that phone away. Last but not least, I'd like to challenge this group to think a lot about the question of whether it's internships, trials. I think we have to, in the workforce, allow for some experimentation in models that don't currently exist, and again, an inadvertent, not particularly productive byproduct of minimum wage has been, if you look at the statistics on internships, they've come way down. And if you think about people's first experience in a workforce, whether it's summer jobs or early jobs, those internships are hugely valuable, and that becomes a very, I think, a big challenge for us all to think through on what kind of incentives and structures we can put in place that probably connect to the educational system and probably connect to even the high school system to actually give people exposure to the social aspects of work experience.
Great. Alfred?
Okay, so I have a kind of diverse background. On the one hand, I'm probably a cheerleader for all of these technologies, having been a computer scientist for many decades and having been head of research at Google. On the other hand, I've been giving a talk on the unintended consequences of data science for quite a while, talking about the limitations of what we know how to do. From that perspective, I've been thinking a lot about the topics here, although unlike Jamie, I have not given any presentations at a conference like this in the last year, so I lower our average considerably. Let me I do have sort of a desire to categorize. Maybe that's comes with the territory of being a computer scientist. So let me talk about technology first. There I have some credentials, I think. I'll talk about society, its impact on society, technology's impact second. My credentials are much weaker there, so take what I say with a grain of salt, although I'll try to summarize to a degree. And then a few thoughts on what we should do from my perspective. So first, I think we all agree automation's happened for a very long time. IT automation has been happening for 50 to 60 years. Sort of think of the time frame of the IBM company as sort of the right time frame for that. And there has been exponential growth throughout that period in IT. So everyone knows of Moore's law. I like to emphasize, though, that it's truly extraordinary what's happened, which is why this doesn't go away. So in my career, every statistic you can measure has changed by at least a factor of 1 million in the power of computational technologies. So there's nothing you can mention to me that isn't 1 million better. Even the phone directory, if you will, of addresses for email was, some tens of pages when I was a student here at Harvard. And now, of course, they're billions, and that's about a factor of 1 million in that, and everything you can think of. And it's had phenomenal effects. Many of them are extremely positive, and we can't forget that. I think that there's no question that IT made these global supply chains possible, and these global supply chains have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China. I think there's a very strong effect on that. So we could think of many, many more. An example was mentioned in terms of that was related to elasticity of demand by Darren. There was an argument made at the end of the internet bubble in around 2002 that there would be no jobs for programmers in the United States. I remember this. I spoke at a National Academy workshop on the subject. Happily, I was a contrarian to that well-established view of labor economists, that not everything would be outsourced. If you will think of outsourcing as automation with respect to the host country, right? It was like automation. I argued there was such elasticity of demand in terms of the need for programming that if you made some aspects of programming less expensive, there would just be way more. And I think that's what can happen in a lot of the spaces that we see. So if robots get very good at some things, there'll be other things which humans do which are more needed. So there are lots of potentially good stories here, and there are indeed very risky stories as well. The machine learning growth, which people equate as synonymous with artificial intelligence and they shouldn't, machine learning growth has been phenomenal. It has been a phenomenon. It has surprised, I dare say, all the computer scientists in the room with the value that it's brought to the organizations that utilize these technologies. And they have been valuable, I think, very broadly to society at large, if we look at the value of search engines or availability of music on demand and the like. There are negatives as well, but lots of positives. The NIPS conference, someone I think is associated with that was at my table, has grown about tenfold in neural information processing site in a very short period of time. So indeed, it was commented earlier on by Andrew Hopper that there'll be a digital representation of everything. That was probably the first thing that you said, or almost the first thing that you said this morning, and that's true. And those of you that are nervous about it realize that's going to be the basis of personalized healthcare, which is almost certainly going to be the difference between dying of cancer and having horrific effects of chemotherapy and getting the targeted therapy that will have an effect on the very unique cancer that is, cancer is not a single disease. It's unique to the individual to a very large extent. So all that's, I think, history. I think to a large extent that's all fact that's going on there. Maybe one other thing, and that's a comment that you just made, Nancy, is there's a very low marginal cost of distribution of information today. So there's some negatives associated with that as well, because anybody can go and put out disinformation, but there's also this ability to self-publish, which in a way is quite remarkable, that everyone has a printing press for the world. Now, if we look at where that goes in the future, there's no end to technological growth that we can see. People would say Moore's law, the ability to do photolithography, improved photolithography has in fact greatly reduced. That's true. But computer scientists have all sorts of tricks up their sleeves to continue to make computers faster at geometric growth rates. So there's no doubt, in fact, it's a very exciting time for computer science because it requires a lot of skill. On the other hand, we don't really know, in my opinion, how to do artificial general intelligence. And I think this relates to Professor Gross's view. We should look at the problems that are nearer term. I don't think we really know how to do it. And I would say the computer scientists in the room, I think, would overwhelmingly agree with me. Does anyone disagree in the computer science community? And you feel free to raise your hand. I'd love a debate later. But I think we don't know that. And I think what Irving said earlier about self-driving cars is equally true. Not only will regulatory and other issues slow down self-driving trucks and cars, we actually don't know how to generalize, in my opinion, sufficiently well to deal with most of the problems that we'll have. So it will be a slow and gradual change into these technologies. One other challenge, imagine summarization of a document. So we can do all sorts of clever tricks to look like we're summarizing a document, but it would not be the equivalent of a Cambridge or Harvard student reading an essay and providing a good summary today. Or this gentleman who's amazing, I must say, and we should all congratulate you. It's truly amazing. One other thing I think that is very worthy of saying, no one has said this today, so maybe I'm going out of school to say it, but I was at a university event in New York City. The biomedical community wants to understand our brain and how our brain works. And they are doing lots of things very rapidly in this domain. So those of us that are concerned about machine learning making predictions about our future, we will probably have biological bases of our future in many ways within the same period of time that we're discussing. And that, with all of the other technologies we have, will represent a fundamental change in our notions of equal opportunity and merit and such things. And it's a very complex issue. I brought that up at the meeting that I was at, and I must say the biomedical people didn't even want to talk about it as to the potential impact of it. So now what's happening in the societal world? Well, there has been a lot of reduction in poverty around the world, that's true. There is indeed a lower labor participation rate, which was mentioned early on by Moshe. That's certainly true, although there are many factors that could contribute to it, one of which very well could be technology. It's clear we see the benefits to education. We all agree, so there's no question that the statistic that was just given on the growth in employment based upon college education is factual, so we see that. We see enormous competition, though, I think, across nation states in this space. which for those that argue for strong regulatory structure within a nation state have to take that into account, because there's going to be very limited ways of acting unilaterally. Just like if one country has a very strong carbon tax, you may just export the carbon production to another country. So the same kinds of things occur there. Another factor that wasn't mentioned is that societies are aging at different rates. So in Japan, there's a very rapid aging of the population. So the notion of labor-saving technologies may be extremely valuable in that society. And in the United States, I don't know so much about Britain, with a large recent immigrant pool and a younger population, we have somewhat less concern about that fact. So automation may very well be driven by some countries which have a much stronger desire than others. The one-child per family impact in China, no doubt, will be quite important as well, even though that's now relaxed. It will take a while. So what can happen? It's hard to say. As I said earlier, there's some places where there's positive elasticity of demand, some places where I think there isn't such positive elasticity of demand, and there'll be effect. I think it's clear that the predominant view is that less skilled individuals, that wasn't the word you wanted to use, I forgot the word. What's the word? Talent. Talent? Weird, I don't know. It's a good debate topic as to what the right word is. But individuals will have to up their game. All of us will have to up our game in this space, and that argues very strongly for education. I wanted to, and I would have said, Nancy, as well, one of the places we should most desire to use technology is in education. Those of you that saw MOOCs and wrote them off because they only help students that otherwise want to learn should not write off technology in education. MOOCs are just essentially the most trivial beginning of what's possible. So I believe there's an enormous opportunity to bring children along, to bring young adults along, to retrain us as we're in our careers on a continuing basis in technology. And the story that you gave about those home health aides, I think, was truly inspirational in something that we do. But broadly, I think we all agree education, job retraining, and all of those things are critical.
Alfred, I'm going to have to ask you to...
Yeah, I'll finish up very quickly. Yeah. I have only I'll make 5 points very quickly. I think there is the possibility, we do create economic systems, right? We all do that, whether we're capitalists or the resident communist in the room. We believe in creating systems. There's no reason we can't create systems that incentivize organizations towards job creation in certain ways. So I don't think there's a priori a reason that that can't happen in efficient ways in this. In the regulatory structures, it's very easy, I think, to hear about a lot of regulatory ideas, but I would suggest to you that the game of competing nation states makes it very hard. And in addition, I ask you, which of you believes your government is going to do a better job of protecting your data privacy than some of the companies that are out there? And at least I, for one, have had the most egregious privacy leaks from data from the federal government. The last one I'll mention, just because I think we should be thinking forward into the far future, I believe that artificial general intelligence will sometime happen. So I have every reason to think that sometime down the road, it could be 50 years or 100 years, computers will do everything that we do. So we will be in a world where we have to find meaning in life. I think well, that's not the dominant goal at the moment. I think we can do an awful lot with computing technology in that as well. So there's an immense amount of opportunity to do things which are very meaningful for people, I think, with computer-mediated approaches.
Thank you. Jamie, Nancy, Alfred.